Listeners, last year was a rough one for transgender Americans, and this year is shaping up to be equally as rough, if not rougher. At time of recording, 740 anti-trans bills have been introduced across 42 states. 31 have thus far failed. 22 have passed. 6 of those have been signed into law. This per the Trans Legislation Tracker. Now, the governmental element is obvious, of course. The second Trump administration has emboldened the anti-trans crusade with its executive order recognizing two immutable genders. It's a declaration of war on, sing along folks, transgender for everybody.
Transgender
You
for
know,
everybody. Everybody's favorite
we need to
line.
reclaim that.
We
We've got
have
it.
to take it back.
Mhm.
We have to take it back.
Yeah, that's ours now. But neither can we forget the institutional attacks from other spheres of American society, right? NYU Langone, of course, they have halted transition-related healthcare for children. This is under the force of no law. The decision was made voluntarily, citing the current regulatory environment, their words. Colleges across the country, such as Brown and Columbia, have cracked down on queer expression with everything from DEI rollbacks to outright bathroom bans in places. This in accordance with Trumpian threats, despite some schools refusing to budge and winning. And although the Education Department's anti DEI Dear Colleague letter has been officially dropped now, some schools are leaving the new rules in place. And of course, we can't forget the role of legacy news outlets like the New York Times in spreading fear mongering, unscientific, nakedly bigoted rhetoric, quoted directly from anti trans activists in places posing as concerned citizens, including Southern Poverty Law Center designated hate groups. It's rough all around. And here to discuss our current moment and how to get away from it is today's guest. She is a biologist, formerly of UC Berkeley, a lifelong trans activist, author of Whipping Girl, a transsexual woman on sexism and the scapegoating of femininity, as well as several other books, most recently, Sexed Up, How Society Sexualizes Us and How We Can Fight Back. I'm talking about Julia Serano. Y'all, Julia, how you doing?
I'm doing relatively okay. Thank you for having me.
I realize I started off kind of heavy there, but you know, I think it is important to point up that we are surviving and we are, you know, in many cases thriving. But there's a lot stacked up against us right now, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, to start us off, wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your scholarship journey. You know, you're a biologist, your PhD is in biochemistry and molecular biophysics. How did you get from there to trans feminist theory? In the course of developing your body of work, do these things intersect or have they developed more in parallel?
Yeah. One of the most common questions I get is, "Oh, you're a biologist. Did you study like gender and sexuality?" And I was like, "No, I didn't." Or at least not formally. Uh so I would say there are like three different tracks that are all kind of going on separately in my life that all sort of converge. So the first one was just like, what do I do with my life career wise or whatever. And so I was always interested in science from a young age. And then when I was in high school, contemplating college, didn't know like what to do. So I just picked biology because that was my favorite of the science classes I took. And
That's the
then,
way I got into English. Yeah, I was just like, well, I
yeah,
got to
yeah,
do
it's just
something.
like, I don't know what I'm, going to do like for the next like half century of my life. It's just like, I like biology. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I did that in college. I didn't want to go into medicine just because of, my own squeamishness about, I don't think I would be a good doctor in that respect. I think I would have very good bedside manner, but when blood is squicks you out a bit, that's probably not a good profession. So anyway, so my favorite of the biology classes I had was biochemistry. So I applied to biochemistry graduate departments and I got into one. And so from there I did kind of a typical like graduate school followed by being a postdoc sort of journey. And so most of what I studied is actually developmental biology, which is how all organisms are comprised of lots of different cells that make different types of tissue. You have like brain cells and muscle cells and so on. It's like, well, how does the body form, right? And so I studied questions related to that, uh, mostly with fruit flies and then later crustaceans. A lot of this work was genetics, so we would try to find the genes involved in that, many of which tend to come up in cancers a lot. So um, and then uh, the last part of that was we did a little bit of what's called Evo Devo, which is trying to understand if crustaceans and insects are actually very closely related, and yet they have very different bodies, like what genes changed over time in order to create those differences. So that was my biology career, and I did that for many years. And then, second of all, I was trans, and that was its own pathway that I went through periods of as a kid struggling with that. I'm Gen X. So back when I was a kid, there was just like zero information about that. So some of it was just me being trans and kind of working towards the point where around the time I turned 30, I was more out as trans and then transitioned. And then I was always very into creating stuff. And for a long time, my main creative outlet was music. And so I was writing songs. I was in a band called Bite Size around the time I transitioned. And I was writing trans themed songs. But if you're writing songs, you have like 50 words or 100 words to like write something. So there's only so much to say. And so
You
then
can't
I
cite your
started.
sources in the middle of a song.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
little
There's no
tough to do.
footnotes in the middle of a song. Although I suppose you could do that. You could like just completely interrupt the music for like for more on this, see blah blah blah, or
Yeah,
for critical
listeners, this
review.
is a challenge. This is a challenge to our musical listeners.
Just put it in the liner notes. It's already there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's how liner notes kind of are like the footnotes for the record, I guess. So anyway, so I was going to a lot of poetry slams because my partner was a co-host of the Berkeley Poetry Slam. So I started doing like slam poems, performance poetry, and I was writing a lot of trans stuff there. But then I found that like that's like 600 words, and as the more I got into uh, trans activism and feminism, I just had a lot of big topics I wanted to talk about. So I started writing essays, and that eventually led to me writing the first book. And so that's mostly what I do as a writer these days. I have written some fiction, I've written some other things, but I mostly write essays, and sometimes those essays come together to make a book. So, so to get back to the biology thing, while for me that the trans and the feminism stuff was not necessarily directly related to biology. It has come up both because of the fact that feminists in general have had a lot of problems with biology, some of which are, I think, extremely unjustified, but there are problems with like some biologists and biological determinists are warranted. So it was useful for that, like kind of navigating that, and that's come up in some of my more feminist themed books. And then nowadays, kind of thrust into the world we live in, where suddenly within a handful of years, people have just decided that biological sex is something that we all completely agree upon and that scientists have written about for like hundreds of years. It has become very useful for debunking a lot of anti-trans suicide pseudoscience, both about the idea about biological sex, and I have a whole video about that that's on my YouTube channel. That's basically a talk length thing, but also the fact that I'm very comfortable like reading science papers and going through research literature has been really helpful for just debunking things like social contagion and a lot of the pseudoscience around gender affirming care and so forth. So the biology thing has been very useful for a lot of the activism I've done, even though that wasn't the plan from the start.
No, yeah, agreed. And if listeners, if you go read Whipping Girl, right, the bits on subconscious sex, on the intrinsic inclinations model, there is stuff that from the biology field that is useful in helping explain a more expansive reading of gender, of femininity. That usually that generally gets lost in how mainstream media describes it. Whipping Girl, of course, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of that. That's next year. And in that text, you discuss at length how the public perception of trans people, in particular, like trans women, is laser focused on our gender, right, as performance, as artificial, right? And there are reasons for that, explicable equally by misogyny as by transphobia, if not more so, right? If we're portrayed in fiction, we're either duplicitous or insane. If we're represented on reality TV, it's in the context of lurid fascination with like a process, right? With putting on and taking off something, makeup, surgery. Here on Workers Lit, of course our beat is the battle for the narrative. How do you perceive just, and this is perhaps a really broad question, but how do you perceive the overall narrative to have changed in public spheres over the past 2 decades, if at all?
Yeah, I think that it might be useful to think of it as a couple different narratives, and in thinking about, especially in thinking about Whipping Girl and other trans writings from then or before then, I think you're always kind of addressing where we are at the moment. And there was, when I was doing the third edition of Whipping Girl, I did a reread of the book. So this is like about 2 years ago. For the first time in a while, like a full reread, and I think a lot of it holds up, especially a lot of the trans misogyny stuff. A lot of the me reacting to like media depictions is definitely that has evolved. And I would say that when I first transitioned, and when I so this is the 2000s, the aughts, as some people call them. Uh, During that time period, like if I would come out to people as trans, like often I was the very first trans person they ever met, and quotes around that because they probably met others, just they didn't know. There is just a very large degree of trans ignorance. And I would say a lot of the depictions, and this was really useful in Whipping Girl for me, in that most of the depictions of trans people were done by people who had never met a trans person. And so what these cis writers and directors would do is they would hear about the concept, and then they would pour their own cisgender gender assumptions into the transgender character. And so this was very useful in like pointing out, um, for instance, the ways in which like trans women were almost universally depicted in one of two ways. Uh, and so in the media depictions chapter, I guess there are a couple media depictions chapters in there, but the one that's called Skirt Chasers, how like the trans revolution is depicted, in Lipstick and Heels, I think is the subtitle of that. Basically, there were two types of trans female or trans feminine character, and so one was kind of the sexual deceiver, who was essentially a passable trans woman, who audiences did not know was trans, who freak cisgender people out because they didn't know they were trans. And
Mm-hmm.
then there are I call them the pathetic transsexuals. Talia Becher, who's an amazing trans philosopher, wrote a paper around the same time where she talked about the deceivers, and she called them the make believers. So this character is a character who doesn't pass at all. So they look like the quote unquote man in a dress. And then people throw a lot of assumptions on that. Some of the ones that you were mentioning, uh, the idea of performance, like there's always a lot of people putting on lipstick, or having their nails done, putting on taking off clothing, which is kind of this idea that trans people are artificial, but also this idea that femininity is artificial, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we say women get all dolled up, but like what do men do? Well, men just scroom, like chimpanzees in the wild, they just scroom, it's natural, where women get all dolled up. And
Mm-hmm.
so noticing these connections, and I think that that's why there's a lot of attention, part of why there's a lot of attention on trans female and trans feminine characters, and less so for trans male and trans masculine characters, why there's invisibility, is it's easier to make trans people look fake if it's a trans feminine person, just because of our assumptions about femininity to begin with.
Yes.
um
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So anyway, so I think back then the main thing I was dealing with, and the trans people were dealing with, was just ignorance. Nobody knew anything about trans people, or very few people did. And if you came out to them, they would usually have one of two reactions. It would either be, "What is that?" or they might be disturbed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, especially now in 2026, where not a day goes by without like a New York Times article or an Atlantic article about trans people, and all the news about anti-trans legislation, and as y'all were referring to the fact that uh, our current president can't go a day without saying the phrase transgender for everybody. Like now what we're dealing with is a completely different environment where it's um just we're flooded with way too much uh awareness and pseudo awareness and disinformation about trans people. And so it's definitely a lot more um it's a different terrain to navigate. And I
Hmm.
feel like a lot of Whipping Girl was written with the idea in mind that most readers probably maybe they knew a trans people or two, but they probably didn't have much information. And nowadays, I feel that, especially a lot of the trans work I do now, I feel it's more like countering anti-trans disinformation. Um, Not so much there are people out there who are obvious bigots who are purposely putting out nonsense and hate
Hmm.
into the world. Um, but then there are a lot of people in the middle who they have a little bit of trans awareness. You know, they probably know, about like 42% of US people in surveys say they know a trans person. So they probably know something, but they're getting both like they're seeing the hate mongering and then they're seeing just asking questions, reasonable sounding stuff from the New York Times. And then they're seeing maybe people who are more pro trans and pro LGBTQ, like standing up for us and trying to counter that. And so, again, it's just, I feel like it's a very shifting environment right now, if that makes sense.
Hmm. No, it's definitely fluid. Like, and that tends to jive with as well. Like, my general perception, and you just put numbers to it in a way that I didn't have access to before. That, like, there's still a lot of people, a lot of cis people who don't know what trans people even are. Like, I didn't know what transness was until like college. And it took me so long after that to figure out that, oh, maybe this applies to me too. Like, it's just not the done thing to tell people that, hey, this is an option.
I think the difference is, 20 years ago, you would not know who trans people are and not hear the president talk about it every day. And now
Mhm.
you have not knowing what they are, maybe more people knowing what they are, but still not enough, and hearing the president talk about it every day. And it's very easy to get whipped into a frenzy of something that you don't understand at all. And I think it's interesting they use the sort of wedge of sports to try to appeal to people's sense of fairness.
Mhm.
We've talked about this before, but to kind of try to be like, well, that's something that we can't object over. But of course, the conversation is never about sports. It's about something else. We've of course talked about that before, but yeah, that's what comes to my mind is it's like this greater awareness, but also much greater, much more in the way of attacks in
Hmm.
general.
Hmm.
I was just wondering if you think, you said you're Gen X, and Lenore's in her like early 30s. Do you think that even though things I think in a lot of ways are worse because of the way the president talks about trans people, do you think that having the language and the understanding of it is easier for young trans people nowadays, like aside from the political climate, like just having that access to books like yours, to even for all the critiques we may have over the way trans people are portrayed in the media, they do have access to trans celebrities that seem to be good people, like good people work looking up to. Do you think in some ways that does make it a little easier for young people to come out or to maybe start to have the language to question who they are or what they were raised with?
Yes, most certainly.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, like literally when I was a kid, there would occasionally be a TV show or a movie that would have a so-called trans character that I almost don't even want to call him that because it was literally just cisgender writers like, oh, well, what if we made this character have a sex change? And it's like people heard the term sex change, and but they had no idea what it was, and um, so yeah, and it was I didn't read anything about trans people until I got to college. And I went through the old card catalog and I looked up transvestite and transsexual, which were the only two words I had heard. And
Mhm.
there were four books in my whole college library that like covering that. And two of them were abnormal psychology books. One of them was Jan Morris's one of the very first trans memoirs. It was called Conundrum, and I forget what the other book was. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, there was just nothing. It took me like a really long time. It wasn't until I moved to New York City that I met another trans person. Um, a lot of this was done through, alternative weeklies and zines and, all types of like trans literature was extremely hard to find. Um, and so then the internet happened, and also trans activism was happening, and I think the two of them definitely are together. And so I think it is really awesome. I think we shouldn't forget or lose track of the site that now trans people, instead of being isolated until they get to college or whatever later date in their life it is, they probably they might go to school with other trans kids. They're going to be aware of, whether it's a trans celebrity or, be able to buy books and read what trans people say. Um, so yeah, I think that is incredibly huge, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. I've been thinking a lot about like whether hypothetically, like, is it worse now or was it worse then? And I think that there's not an easy answer to that, because
Mm-hmm.
it was just really hard to find anything and to even get to the point where you could transition, um, to be able to find like, the right doctors. Like most doctors wouldn't have anything to do with it. Um, so, but at the same time, just the onslaught of like every single day, just these anti-trans news stories and legislation, it really, really, really is a huge, or I feel, and I know a lot of people in my life feel, like a huge psychological burden of like just every day. It's like, oh God, not this. Oh
Mm-hmm.
God. And like you think that like things are already really bad, and then like I just saw today the state of Idaho, it's their house, so it might not become a law. I don't like doing a lot of fear mongering about a lot of times bills are proposed, but I think the Idaho House passed a restroom bill that comes with like 5 years, a 5 year prison sentence
Yes.
for using the so-called incorrect bathroom. It's just like you think that like how could it get any worse, and they always find ways to make it worse. So I definitely don't want to trivialize it, and I definitely believe that if the right wing of this country, if they absolutely got their way, which right now we're in this very contested time period where the administration has just essentially really hardcore pushed authoritarianism across so many different domains in our culture, and there's a huge amount of pushback, and his disapproval levels are so high. At the same time, it's like a difficult time period because people are worried about, well, what happens if
If they get their shit together.
yeah, if they get their shit
Yeah.
together, which they probably won't. But um so I definitely don't want to like seem overly optimistic, but I think there are a lot of really good aspects about being trans now that were not true back then. And I do really think, generally with LGBTQ people in general, I really do think it's like the metaphor of the you can't put the toothpaste back into the tube. Like
Mm-hmm.
like for most of my life and for generations before me, like queerness was really hard for people to find other people like them. It
Mm-hmm.
was really hard to find community. Many people just remained closeted their whole life, or even if they found that community, they remained closeted about it. And I just feel that at this point, the tube is out of the toothpaste. Like almost 10% of like young people today identify as LGBTQ, plus in some capacity. They can still do a lot of harm, but I think that I don't know that they can kind of erase the last 20 some years of trans people and the broader queer community, um, kind of being out, and especially also the I don't know how many people are like actually pro trans, but there's a good solid chunk of people who are pro trans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is that? Maybe it's 25% or 35% of the population who would describe themselves as pro LGBTQ.
100% right here. Yeah.
Yes. And even if some of those people are maybe overvaluing it, maybe they wouldn't show up for a real fight if necessary. I still think that just a big chunk of the country completely disagrees with probably a similarly equal other quarter or third of the country that is vehemently anti-LGBTQ. And so, yeah. So I think that, you know, they're the best of times and the worst of times. Sorry.
I think like on
Um,
many issues, it's a situation where a lot of Americans, maybe even most Americans, just don't want to think about it, right?
Mhm.
And that's not a good thing. That's not where we need to be. But you see that on racial issues, you see that on economic issues, foreign policy, certainly. Um, that they just people being like, I just don't like just keep it over there, and I don't want to think about it one way or another. They get mad at right wingers yelling about it, and people on the left yelling about it, and everybody in between. And that's something we got to break through, that apathy as well. We've talked about that, but that's also something I've noticed just in community activism is it's less often vitriolic than it is like that's just not something that I want in my life, which it is in your life. Deal with it. Your kid or your family member or your neighbor is going to be queer. Like that's just how it's going to work. But it's something that can be potentially worked with. We'll see. Um, Something that comes to my mind is that right now is, and it was something that I just kind of put the one and two together a little earlier today. Was this Save America Act thing is happening right now, as what they're calling it. It's Trump's big landmark bill, his new big landmark bill. And the main thing that's getting talked about in the bill is a bunch of stuff about voting, changing how voting works, of course, because they don't want fair elections. But also in the bill is this pretty much total ban on gender affirming care for people under the age of 18. Um, and I was looking to like, why are those in the same bill? And I was looking into it, and it seems the reason is to basically discipline Republicans into voting for the bill. Like the Republicans that are maybe a little like sketchy on it, their opponents could then attack them for not voting for the bill, and say, oh, you voted for you voted against getting rid of trans health care for children, is basically their plan. It's very devious. And it occurred to me that there is something very symbolic about that, about like with the entire political project. The reason that there are certain like minority groups that like trans people that are used as scapegoats, um, it and as kind of part of the tip of the spear to try to push through a larger project. I thought that was interesting. I was wondering if you've seen. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. That's just like a half-formed thought that was occurring to me earlier today, and I was like, "There's something there." Maybe I'm not all the way there. I'm working on it though. I wanted to know what you thought of that and what you think about the Save America Act in general, where you see things like that going and how we can push back on that.
yeah, sure. So I was really confused because I think it came out in it was like a Trump, like one of his not tweets, Truth Socials or whatever,
Truths,
and
yeah.
and he was like, we have to pass the Safe Act, and he was just talking, and then he went into like sort of like the transgender for everybody thing, and at first my impression was that he was just confusing different bills,
Entirely
but
possible.
yeah, which could have happened, but also because he kind of throws that into every like speech nowadays.
Right.
But maybe it was purposefully planned, and I agree that it could be kind of devious to by making it a trans bill, like a way to sneak like kind of one of the potentially biggest poison pills as far as like disenfranchising a huge percentage of American voters. Um, I mentioned this uh, to one of my sisters, and she hadn't even heard of it. It's like
Mm.
yeah, it's being debated. Like the House already passed a version of it last year, and they're talking about maybe getting rid of the filibuster to pass it. And I don't know if you've changed your birth certificate when you got married and changed your name, but you might want to look into this.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think it's devious because of that reason. I think it also the average person, like you were talking about, the amount of apathy, and most people both kind of don't really want to think about politics all that much, and they don't want to think about politics all that much, and are the what used to be a media system where if you were watching TV or picking up a paper, you would probably know some of the main stuff that was going on. And that's completely disappeared because a lot of people don't watch TV at all anymore. And everyone's getting their news through whatever social media sources they're they're following to a large degree. And so it's just um scary that a bill that's like this, I mean, that not only does horrible things to trans people, and again, I think most people like kind of ignore the trans stuff, but is that as a way to like a lot of people potentially in November maybe realizing that actually they can't vote because they don't have a passport and their birth certificate doesn't match their current name. Um, yeah, I mean, these are the type of things that are extremely intractable now. It seems like the Democrats are holding steady on this.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean they're done if this thing not really, but it changes the elective elections completely. I just thought it was so interesting that they like put the transgender anti-transgender stuff in the bill. It seemed so like I don't know. It's just a thing I keep turning over in my head of like you said, it seems like a separate thing, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the Republicans have done this numerous times where I mean, they try to sneak. It's kind of funny because they try to sneak like anti-trans stuff into like regular things. Like if it's just like a budget bill or whatever, they'll try to put like some anti-trans policies in there. But this is sort of the reverse. They're turning it into an
Mhm.
anti-trans bill so that people don't realize the effects it has to other people. I've also seen it's supposedly up in the air regarding that this could potentially hurt Republicans if it were to pass, which would be awful. It'd be the hugest voter disenfranchisement in, you know, like current history in the country. But that if it does pass, that it could actually hurt Republicans even more, just because of uh, the demographics, them being an older party and kind of more affluent people voting for Democrats. Kind of the last few election cycles means that more of those people will have passports or will have the money to like, you know, get the right birth certificate change and everything like that. So I don't know. I mean, whatever, if it passes, it's bad. It's just bad across the board. Bad for trans people, bad for people having the right to vote. um, but I just think it's just a huge mess. And I don't think, you know, a lot of Republicans are just going along with it because Donald Trump will ruin their lives if they don't vote with him. So
Mhm.
yeah.
It's easy, I think, to fall into the in many ways like the far right like political media spheres within like our ruling class, right? In many ways it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that like they're on the cutting edge of like communication, of like, you know, these people all go on each other's podcasts, they have this interlocking media sphere. But I think also like in a similar way that you know, on a lot of issues you know, Palestine's a huge recent example. On a lot of issues, like establishment Democrats are out of touch with their base, you know, because they only talk to their consultant class and not, you know, the voters that they're continuously polled.
Lenore, I have it on good authority from Matthew Iglesias that about how the direction the party needs to take. I'm not sure what you're talking about. The New York Times has been very
Cut
clear about
more
that.
red tape, build more housing, just do more of everything. It'll work. What's
Uh,
that regulation enforcing that? You know, and we'll get to it. We'll get to it. But yeah, no,
yeah.
like it is something that's crossed my mind as well. That like I think there is a similar out of touchness for the right as well to try and sneak these things in here, right? As a sort of as a sort of reverse poison pill, right? Because it's you know, it's as you say, like Julia, it cuts both ways, right? Like a lot of people who profess to be, you know, pro LGBTQ, they may be, but it's like pretty far down their list in terms of like what determines their political action, right? And at the same time, people who, you know, may have swallowed a lot of the disinformation about us, who may profess to be against us and whatnot, that's also like not the number one thing moving them, right? You know, it's bad that that they've still swallowed this stuff, you know, but I don't know. Nevertheless, it's a weird sort of it's a weird sort of tea leaf to try and read, like just where these things will go. Um, I do think you're right that like there is generally so many more opportunities for us to make interventions, right? We talk about interventions on the show a lot, working people, marginalized people making their voices heard in forums that aren't necessarily built for them, right? News media, the political arena, right? I do think there is an advantage to so many there's so many more alternative media spheres springing up in terms of independent media that it's just way too, as titanic as an institution as like the New York Times or the Atlantic are, right? They don't appear to have the sway that they once did, right?
Yeah, and I think this is a huge thing that I've heard people like mention this, but I don't think it's really getting out there, especially giving everything with the New York Times, especially turning anti-trans. Um, and but before I just say, I do want to say, because since we talked about the Democratic consultant class and Matt Iglesias, um, I I think it's worthwhile to plug. It's an essay that I wrote that was in a forum for Boston Review, that I also turned into a video if you go to my YouTube channel. And it's basically, they have different titles, but it's why anti-trans, why Democrats moderating or abandoning trans rights like won't work for them and will actually politically backfire in
Yeah.
addition
Yes.
to being morally wrong.
We'll
And
link
some
that
of
in
the
the show
things
notes as well, so folks can check that out.
yeah, and the thing you were saying about polls is exactly true, is that trans rights are always ranked like right at the bottom. Nobody really cares about trans rights, and the only people who rank it really highly are often trans people and the most dedicated of transphobes. um, and so it's not a winning issue for Democrats, and all it will do is further alienate your alienate the base that you have, alienate LGBTQ plus people and people who are pro that. All you have to do is look at what's happening in the UK right now, where essentially the British government has done a lot of the things, the Labour government has done a lot of the things that the Matt Iglesias types want. Is like, well, let's throw the right a bone and give them immigration and give them like eliminating trans people, and they are plummeting. And the Green Party there has gotten a lot of those gains. They are not winning any so-called moderate voters or right-wing voters. They already have parties they can vote for.
Hmm.
So anyway, that was a little digression that was important there. But then
Yeah.
I don't think that the Democratic Party and a lot of mainstream institutions have really fully understood what this moment means, where essentially, like, what ABC News does or what the New York Times says, only a handful of people are really going to see that. It used to be they could put stuff out, the New York Times put something out, and then that will show up on all the news shows on ABC, NBC, CBS, and then the average person consumes it, or is at least exposed to it. And now that's not the case. I feel that with a lot of the anti trans stuff the New York Times is doing, it's like, well, most people who read the New York Times, who actually bother to read it, probably already have a position, whether correct or incorrect, on trans people.
Hmm.
I don't think they're pushing the dial at all. Um, in fact, I think some of that has very much backfired to the point where, like, I listen to, like, one of my escapisms is baseball. I like baseball. And so I'll be listening to a baseball podcast, and Jesse Single will come up as a punchline of a joke. I'm like, wait, what? And I think it was back in like 2018 when he published the big trans
The witch hunt thing.
yeah, when children say they're trans piece that was a cover story of the
Mm.
Atlantic. And back then there was a lot of people just didn't know better. They're like, oh, actually we should be concerned about, this gender affirming care. Like, it seems like there are questions there. Same thing when sports came up a couple years later. Oh, well. And now I think more and more people just realize that that's like it's a Republican talking point. Like,
Hmm.
it's already coded. And so I don't think the New York Times is really changing any minds. But I think it also gets to the point that, especially like the Mamdani election, like, speaks to this. to the point where like all of the mainstream institutions, the Atlantic, the New York Times, a lot of the TV news shows were all like just pushing anti talking points, and he won.
Yeah.
Because he was reaching people in other ways through social media, or just being out there, like in New York City every day. And he changed
Yeah.
people's minds and got a lot of people who wouldn't normally vote, especially a lot of younger people, or progressives and marginalized people who kind of feel like the mainstream Democratic Party doesn't really care about us. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, actually this guy seems like he does. And I think that this is potentially a very exciting time, in that, like, progressive people and people who are good on social justice issues, who aren't afraid that, like, oh, what if the New York Times calls me woke? Like
Hmm.
the people who are like, screw that. Like a lot of those people now can reach people. So I think there's a huge gatekeeping thing that has been lifted, at the same time that the diversity of the media ecosystem right now has also created all these growing conspiracy theories, and the far right MAGA talking points, and those ecosystems where they only ever talk to one another. So I think it's scary, but I think there are also opportunities for change that go outside of the old system.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
I would like to say I'm on the record. The Atlanta Journal Constitution described me as a spirited young man. So I am on the record now. I don't know. We'll have to go back. I'm not. You know, it's been a couple years. I'm not sure. AJC, you'll have to let me know if I'm still a spirited young man. You were. Am I wrong in saying that you were actually in a New York Times issue like shortly before their like crazy turn? Like it was like a year before that piece, right? Like 2017, something like that.
Yeah, so there are two. One was this was a really cool story that I will share. So one, I got to write something for their Pride issue. Um and it's, if you go to my on my website, on the writing page, I literally list links to like everything I've written. And so I have like, the links are always, they're free links, and so I go to archived versions of the New York Times, so you don't actually have to open up the New York Times.
Thank you
um
so much.
so one of them was, I was invited to be
Like
a part of
that.
the Pride issue. I think it was 2019, which is
Mm.
right before they took the sharp
Yeah.
anti-trans turn. And
Hmm.
it was the editor of it. They hired an editor who basically did the Pride issue, and so my piece had to go through a New York Times editor, but it was fine. It was about, I wrote about biological sex, about like biology, like all sciences, are way more complex, and it was than a simple answer, right? And so I wrote that, and so that's a cool thing to happen. But something that was even cooler was right around the time, so this is like around 2016, right around the time where I would start getting nibbles of journalists who are trying to look for, this is when the anti-trans coalition was just starting to form. A lot of journalists were trying to maybe find something. And so this journalist wrote me, and kind of with some questions that started out like kind of sort of critical questions, and I answered her questions and everything. And then she actually did an interview with me about trans misogyny,
Hmm.
and like my work as a trans feminist, and that was somehow in the New York Times. And you can't even imagine that now. This is like 2016, so it
Yeah.
was literally, like just right when the tipping point was happening. um
I think in that other, sorry to cut you off. I think in that other interview, even you mentioned like how it's a shift, certainly, like this policing of like what is a woman, right? This effort to sort of cleave trans women off from women more broadly, even though women is what we are. Like it's reminiscent of a dynamic that you mentioned um decades ago, when there was a similar sort of ire targeted at just lesbians, like cis lesbians, right? This question of, oh, like, are they do they belong in these spaces, do they not? It's this weird sort of push, isn't there, to make femininity, to make feminism like more like compatible with patriarchy almost. Like, and it's a level, it's a level of nuance that, like, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't expect to see it discussed in a mainstream outlet today.
yeah. And yeah, and what you're saying is definitely true. And in fact, I think one of the biggest problems. So I think the average person, when you say what is feminism, it's like, well, it's for women's rights,
Mm.
and there's truth to that, right? That is part of what feminism has done. But just when you think of it in solely that way, rather than like it's a feminism is a movement to end sexism
Yes.
and all forms of marginalization, which is kind of what I would say, or what a lot of people would say. And it's you want to understand kind of why sexism happens, why gender oppression happens, and what do we do societally, structurally to change that, right? Um, but to the average person, it just feels like it's women's rights. And when it becomes that simplified, it becomes really easy for far right people or far right people pretending to be liberals to come in and do the far right meme that has always been the far right meme, for like throughout the 20th century, which is protecting women and children,
Hmm.
right? That and it's real, and that's what happened in the UK with the gender critical movement there. And here in the US, thankfully, we don't have that per se, but the evangelicals, religious right, have basically taken it up, and that has become all the anti-trans talking points. So it's like protecting children from gender affirming care and transgender for everyone, and protecting young girls from transgender from men in sports or whatever, right? So yeah, and I think it's really important to try to get people to understand feminism as being actually more deeply rooted, and wanting to change inequities in society rather
Hmm.
than protecting any one particular class.
Yes.
um, and I think that is yeah, that's fundamental to feminism. And I think most people who are kind of actively involved in feminism uh, understand that to be true. And it's just kind of the general world where something like lean in feminism, like let's just have more women CEOs and lean in, right? And I think that looks even more farcical than it did at the time, now that like essentially all the tech dude bros have kicked out all the DEI, and have gone like full on raging misogynists, and all the rest.
And just increasingly esoteric.
They couldn't handle the like 2% of women CEOs or whatever it was. Like that alone, they were like, okay, we've gone too far.
It's
You
always
know.
that skew of like women being perceived, as being present and vocal, like so much more than we actually are.
Yeah, definitely. And like, so especially here, so I'm in the Bay Area. I live in Oakland. Um, and so I have a lot of friends who are in tech, and even if you don't, like, it's in the news because they're sort of like local stories. And I just think that because a lot of the tech workers, some of whom were like beginning to unionize, and where they were in like kind of the late 2010s, becoming more and more vocal about like, hey, it's not okay if our company does this. And there were a lot of worker protests and everything. I think that definitely is sort of what's driving all of these tech companies to kind of both want to get rid of all their employees, which, let's face it, like, you know, um, basically the owners of companies have always wanted to get rid of, they always want the labor, but they don't want to have to deal with the people doing the labor. And I think that's part of why they're all on the AI bandwagon, like wanting to replace all their employees. Like, let's not have them. And you also see it, like a lot of these people who are raging misogynists who, like, they want AI girlfriends. It's like they just, it's like they want what they want without the people. Anyway, it's all very dystopian.
Hmm.
But I definitely think that is, I think that helped to fuel. There were other things going on, but helped to fuel kind of the big anti DEI initiatives that have been coming out since the Trump administration. I'm glad that they ended on the DEI, and it just ended up being like, let's fire all the women and people of color and queer people, and make everything inaccessible. Yeah. So.
Hmm. In terms of that sort of thing, right? Because there's certainly universities, there's certainly companies that have knuckled under, um, whether or not there's any actual force of law behind their decision to. Um, and there's some institutions that haven't. And I wonder, is it just like the whim of their like executive class? Like, is it public pressure? Like, what separates in your mind one type of institution from the other when that decision is made to comply or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, there's going to be individual differences between different institutions, but I think a lot of them are kind of temporal.
Hmm.
By which I mean, just in thinking about the university crackdown, and that has been exacerbated since the second Trump administration began, but that was already happening. With regards to, say, the massive crackdown against students protesting um, the Gaza war.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then there was also the Claudia Gay stuff, where
Hmm.
essentially like woke and DEI was used to basically by billionaires like that one guy Bill Acker or whatever, but other people and some of these institutions just essentially push this thing, a phony plagiarism uh, or a very suspect plagiarism charge, into basically getting uh, a black woman fired from a university president. I think she was president, maybe I forget her
I
exact
believe
position.
so, president. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and and I was making fun of the lean in thing and everything. And I do think that like the world is not going to be saved by having like more women and marginalized people be CEOs. But I do think that purposefully targeting high ranking people in institutions because they're women, because they're people of color, because they're queer, and so on, is very, very bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
um,
Knock on effects for sure.
Hmm.
yeah, and so I think all that stuff was already happening, and I think there were a lot of the schools were already sort of somewhat uh, worried about being targeted by these things, and so they would start to capitulate. And then I think there's just a certain point in time where, because Trump is perceived, his administration is perceived as going too far, and then all of a sudden you're starting to get public pushback. Um, Whether it's related to tariffs and or ice and or we've been in two new wars in the last like 2 months or whatever. Like there's so much pushback against him now. I think it temporarily, as time moves on, it becomes easier for people to stand their ground. And
Hmm.
as a general rule, I don't think institutions are good or bad. They can do good, they can do bad. And a lot of times what keeps institutions kind of on the good side of that line is people within those institutions, whether they're the workers there, whether they're if it's a university like alumni, or they're standing like, can they, you know are young college students going to want to go to their university, like all these things. You can push institutions to the good if they feel like they will get called out if they do bad stuff. And what the kind of the anti woke, anti DI thing was, they were trying to push that in the other direction. They were trying to push those universities in a reactionary way, like let's go back to how it was, where it's just like white men running everything, and we will go after you if you're too woke, or you have DEI programs, or you have a black woman as your president, and so on. So I think that that's always a shifting line, and that's why every social justice movement also has a counter backlash against it. And that's unfortunately that's why we have to like keep fighting, keep, like the work is never done. And unfortunately, a lot of the progress we've had over the last decade of like recognition of things like Black Lives Matter and Me
Hmm.
Too, and uh and so on, there's been a pushback, but we will push back the other way. And
Hmm.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, you say that the work is never done. I guess we're gonna see I have high hopes that when this episode comes out, it's going to solve everything. But in case it doesn't, the work is never done. We're
Mhm.
coming up towards the end here. I wanted to see Lenore or Jen. Do either of you have any burning questions before we kind of wrap it up here?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think there's, to sort of tie it back to the beginning, right? There, what you say is true. This sort of reactionary turn has been happening for like a long time. To sort of tie it back to the trans legislation tracker, right? The last 6 years, like year over year, there has been more and more of this stuff trying to be pushed. Most of the time it fails, but the fact that you know there is still this force allowed to promulgate that sort of thing in politics is alarming nonetheless, right? But you know, you look at it from on the other hand, right? It's not grassroots in nature. It's artificial. It's manufactured. It is these anti-trans, anti-progressive, anti-woman narratives. Whatever dimension that they take, I think it is important for us to keep calling out how manufactured they are, how fake they are, how disconnected they are from our needs. I think there's a lot of people out there who are doing that very well. Um, I do want to ask you, what do you see as cause for certainly there's a lot of ways you can answer this, but what do you see as cause for hope more broadly, like right now, and trans join more specifically, and either of those, both of those, you can answer.
Yeah. Yes, it's very dark times to think about like what's promising. Um, I do think that I mean anything can happen. I do feel compared to a couple years ago a lot more optimistic that even though like the anti-trans legislation just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, that and unfortunately for those who live in those states, that it's getting worse and worse and worse in solidly Republican states. I think in general, the as a general rule, the average person isn't falling for the anti-trans demonization. They kind of they sometimes don't care, or maybe they're pro-trans and they recognize that a lot of this is it's an astroturf campaign, that it's Republicans doing what Republicans do, um, and so um, I feel a little optimistic that people by and large are not buying this and seeing it as part of this horrible, evil entity that's called MAGA. This is part of what they're doing, and most people don't want to be a part of it. So I think that that is a promising thing. And we talked a little bit about the way in which kind of our fractured media ecosystem has created space for, while the New York Times will not publish a trans writer anymore, unlike back in the day where they would sometimes do that, there are other ways for us to get our voices out. And so I see that as a very promising thing. And especially with younger and younger people, it used to be that like the younger demographics, they would be more on the left side of the political spectrum, but like hardly any news would reach them, right? Like because when I was young, I was Green Party, because this was before Jill Stein, and Green Party is where like a lot of lefties like would go, but like you wouldn't hear anything about the real progressive candidates running, because everything was really controlled by the three TV stations
Yeah.
and everything. And now that is not true at all. And I think that there are ways now for progressive people and for marginalized groups to get their word out, especially to younger people who are not reading the New York Times or watching the CBS News with Barry Weiss, right?
Yeah.
So,
Which, by the way, speaking of, just had a walkout today at CBS News because people who work there are pissed.
Let's go.
So,
Hmm.
maybe some progress there from the, like you said, people inside institutions can do good things. I wanted to point up a really before we finish, a cool story here, on this exact same thing here in Georgia last year, in DeKalb County. We have State Senator Alina Parent, Democrat, and she was basically sided with Republicans a year ago on with a bunch of anti-trans stuff. It was basically, bought into the whole, okay, the Democrats need to throw side trans people and the Republicans will love us. Well, she was a year ago, almost today, it was a year ago, a couple days ago, on a call with a group of parents, and told them her exact words were, um, she said, "You can go right to heck." I guess she's afraid to say to hell. "I don't think I'll lose re-election based on you people screaming at me." Well,
Wow.
she just announced she will not be seeking re-election. The Atlanta DSA and some other groups put pressure on her. They've replaced her with we're going to see who ends up. We're going to have our primaries, but it's going to be pretty much everybody is going to be a pro-trans nominally, at least pro-trans candidate. We'll see. We got to hold them to account, of course. But that's a small example there, but it's just an example of like, actually, no, like we can hold these people to account, where whatever side of the political spectrum they may fall on. So I thought that was encouraging I just got that news. So I thought that was fun because I remember being very annoyed with her when I saw that. I was like, you can't even tell us to go to hell. You're going to tell us to go to heck. Like for that alone, you're gone. For that alone. So yeah, encouraging stuff. Well, Julia, where can people find you online? What would you like to plug? We'll have everything linked in the episode notes, but just so people can hear it as well.
Sure, yeah. So I am at Julia Serano. That's with one R. It's the uncommon Serano spelling, Serano. And so I have a website, juliaserano.com, which I know a lot of times people don't like to go to websites, but my writing page literally has links to every online thing I've written, as well as to my books, but every online thing I've written for like 20 years. I write a lot. I routinely publish essays about gender, sexuality, science, and social justice. They currently go out on both Medium and Substack, and you can get links to those there. I have several books that you can find out about there. My most recent one, Sexed Up, is basically about the tendency to sexualize women and marginalized groups. I'm coming at it from a more sex positive way. It's not a sex negative discussion of sexualization, but trying to understand why associating somebody with sex or portraying them as excessively sexual or marked by sex tends to have a delegitimizing or degrading effect on people. And I think it happens across all marginalized groups. So I definitely talk about the sexualization of women, but I also get into how other marginalized groups are affected by that. And yeah, I'm mostly on Blue Sky. If you want, if it, at Julia Serano, you'll find me on most platforms. I'm often not active there. I tend to be active on Blue Sky, and I'm doing more and more video essays on my YouTube channel, which is also at Julia Serano.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on Workers Lit. We'd love to have you back anytime. And Jen or Lenore, y'all have anything to close us out here? Lenore's usually good at coming up with something clever. Not to put you on the spot.
Am I really?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean we're 3 months into what's going to be a very trying and horrifying year, but I'm encouraged every day by the community that I've found, by the people that I get to yap with, certainly. And it's always a reminder that you're not alone. That there are people who are out there, whether they're doing like direct action, whether they're doing like direct activism against some of these institutions that are folding, or just trying to live their lives, just trying to be visible, and just trying to exist, and just by existing, being a positive influence on people and their worldview. Like it's if you go outside, if you go into, any of the trans femme literature discourse that I frequent, like whatever community you find, just be active and be supportive, and don't be afraid to don't be afraid to seek out your people. There's a lot of us out there.
No better way to end it than that.
Transgender for everybody.
Transgender for everybody. Bye, y'all.
Take care.
Pages upon pages, words of wisdom from other workers' brow. Got my nose to the spine, nose soaking up all the wisdom of their will now. The workers' tongue and story, now we wanna know every right we enjoy. Away from the workers.